think of utmost importance, both theoretical, intellectually, and practically for Ukrainians and regional societal development, especially in the context of these profound structural transformations that we are experiencing now. The major purpose of my presentation is to try to describe and to discuss the ever-changing constellations of power relations in Ukraine, and to make an attempt to find out what their prospects for the overall society might be. I'm going to discuss the process of political degradation of Ukraine, and at the same time I'm going to make an attempt at the theoretical conceptualization of the nature of the current Ukrainian political regime. I'm going to define it in terms of oligarchic rule, bearing features of super-presidentialism. But my major question, which I will seek to address in my paper, is whether developmental state possible in contemporary Ukraine. Let me start with a brief historical introduction into contemporary Ukrainian politics and political changes. Ukrainian politics is usually looked at in terms of opposition. It's democracy versus authoritarianism. For example, American political scientist from Temple University, Luke Conway, several years ago produced the notion of soft authoritarianism, soft authoritarian regime, to describe Ukrainian political constellations in particular. Those scholars and commentators who define Ukrainian polity as some sort of authoritarian rule, they would make the next conclusion about the nature of its economic system. It's usually being branded as an oligarchic arrangement which defies rules of competitive market and rational capitalism. Thus, the notion of capitalists without capitalism reigning supreme on the post-Soviet terrains, as opposed to the capitalism without capitalists generated by East and Central European transformation. Left-wing sociologists of Marxian bent, for example, Michael Buravoy, interpret post-socialist social changes on post-Soviet terrains as a failure at transformation and a success at making a transition from relatively developed, industrialized, just social systems, a social system of Soviet days, to the depth of dependent underdevelopment and involution. I have to confess that I have myself paid my due to this normativist view and normativist criticism of the nature of Ukrainian societal dynamics. And I have been producing moralizing, as Karl Marx would call it, criticism of Ukrainian version of the really existing post-socialism, stressing its extremely gloomy prospects for the development. In what follows, I will be seeking to present an approach to the societal dynamics of Ukraine, which goes beyond both normativist rejection and acquiescent apology of the social reality. I'm also intending to take into account the complex interplay of destructive and creative elements, while attempting to frame the evolution of the Ukrainian state in terms of the developmental state. I will begin my discussion by addressing the political developments in Ukraine over the last 15 years with an aim at identifying how oligarchic clientelistic polity of neo-patrimonial bent is beginning, I'm stressing, is just beginning to show signs of moving into the directions of developmental state and its policies. In late 90s, I was fortunate and honored to be affiliated with the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna. When there, I had a chance to meet an American political scientist, Jane Flex, who was a visiting fellow there, and she presented her then the newish book titled American Dream in Black and White. Jane Flex claimed in her book that the United States as a society, as a polity, came into being literally through war, contract, and convention. Consequently, the prevailing nature of our founding, or US founding, is the founding itself. The foundation is potentially very shaky and unstable. It's very shaky and unstable. Only certain kinds of individual can make a valid contract. Only certain actors can represent and enact the will of all. They must act on behalf of universal principles, not their own interest, and they have to be abstract individuals. This passage brings us to the heart of problems to be discussed in my presentation. Actions of major political players on nationwide Ukrainian scene and their implications for the direction and outcomes of multidimensional transformation we are experiencing now. Rapid and profound societal changes which Ukraine is now undergoing are an outcome of different factors where structure and agency are tensely intertwined. For the sake of ideal-typical analysis, it is productive, I guess, to consider political changes in Ukraine as a result of conscious construction of critical political players, which act under existing constraints imposed upon them by institutions, rules, and available resources. Thus, I will make an attempt to outline the possible theoretical approaches to the issue of what actors within the state and political societies, within the state and political society of Ukraine play the most critical role, and I will try to address the question again whether it is realistic to talk about the potentially rising developmental state in Ukraine. Developments in Ukrainian politics at the turn of the centuries, in 20th and 21st centuries, were convincingly showing that key social and political actors were quite incapable of making valid contracts, basically acting in contrast to the prescription offered by Jane Flex in her conceptualizing of a viable political system. Thus, political life was a highly personalized, unstable and volatile affair. According to Weber, the specific function performed by political institutions in general and parliaments in particular, are to make it possible to achieve the best solution, relatively speaking, by process of negotiation and compromise. Again, I stress, by process of negotiation and compromise. And British sociologist of Greek origin, Nikos Mouzelis, has come up with a very useful notion of oligarchic parliamentary rule to describe the situation in interwar Greece. He has suggested to define the institutional design, the most salient features of which are political organizations based on powerful oligarchies that cut across different levels of society as oligarchic parliamentary rule. This situation entails the existence of a regime which severely restricts autonomous public sphere, thus making politics the concern of a very limited group of people. Strengthening of the state capacities merely leads to acquisition of control over the state by these oligarchies from within, or in terms of more recent political science discourse, the capture of the state is taking place. While the formal dimensions of democracy are being preserved under the auspices of such system, the participatory character of liberal arrangement is being rejected or severely limited. And the peculiarity of Ukrainian situation in comparison with that of interwar Greece is that Ukraine has been oscillating between two extremes, between parliamentary oligarchy and presidential oligarchy. And right now, we have recently witnessed the transformation of the more parliamentary oligarchic rule being transformed into presidential-centered rule. Presidential oligarchic regime tends to replace the rule of law by a rule of man. Rule of man in a traditional cultural setting is usually a dominance of a big man, to borrow this useful notion from anthropology. And this phenomenon is quite widespread in southeastern societies and cultures. Anthropologists point out that in a situation when the society is lacking formal institutions, formal structures and formal norms, which are usually and normally associated with impersonal modernity, this vacuum is filled by a big man or leader who creates a network of patron-type relationships around himself. The society is entangled by the network of such relations. Every member is a patron, client, or both altogether. Perhaps these interpersonal relations perform a very useful function of filling the existing blanks in formal structuration. This, of course, totally redefines the whole system of seemingly Western practices. Such societies don't know the principle one person, one vote, since different people have different influence attributed to their votes. Less fortunate agrees with the richer one, not because they share their more successful neighbors' views, but because they are hoping to get favors in return for their support. Yet there is very surprising feature inherent to this traditional setting. Surprisingly, this traditionalism does not entail stability of social networks, in this case political parties, for example. On the contrary, the whole arrangement is highly unstable. Why is that? It is because it's based not on norms, rules and institutions, but on individuals and personalities and their individual interests. I think we can claim that a similar phenomenon is being witnessed in current Ukrainian politics, where practices of shifting alliances and switching sides have become a norm of political activity. And anthropologists who have been studying southeastern so-called traditional Southeast Asian cultures claim that within this framework it is morally permitted to leave big men for somebody who gives more. It is even necessary for reasons of personal and economic safety. The case in point are political trajectories of major leaders of Ukrainian opposition. I mean Yulia Tymoshenko and Arseniy Yatsenyuk. Yulia Tymoshenko had begun her political career as an ally of then the Prime Minister of Ukraine, Pavlo Kutuev, who had been an arch-enemy of then the President Leonid Kuchma. Then Tymoshenko switched sides and she joined presidential camp, then deserted presidential camp, and began relatively autonomous political career. Arseniy Yatsenyuk, one of the leaders of so-called United Ukrainian Opposition, began his career as an acting chair of the National Bank of Ukraine, the chief financial regulator in bank and financial sector according to Ukrainian constitution. So he was appointed an acting chair of the National Bank during the very controversial presidential campaign of 2004-2005, when Viktor Yanukovych clashed with Viktor Yushchenko. The bank chair at that time, Serhiy Tihipko, was on leave to run Viktor Yanukovych's presidential campaign. Later, Yatsenyuk managed to win the trust of President Viktor Yushchenko and then launched an independent political career on his own. It is therefore legitimate to claim that Ukrainian political system is still predominantly a clientelist one. One of the students of Greek political system and Greek politics offered quite penetrating account of clientelism and its implications for the workings of party political and parliamentary systems, as well as for the whole state machinery and state institutions. What does clientelism mean? Its immediate implications are primarily structural and organizational. It inhibits the formation or subverts the expected operation of ostensibly modern institutions and groups. Political parties, in particular, regardless of their labels, programs, and other paraphernalia of modernity, merely consist of unstable coalitions of patrons at the head of their respective clienteles. Coalitions put together solely for the conquest of the office, which is essential and sufficient if protection and services to clients are to be provided. Voters, in turn, behave as clients, each supporting their own patron and switching parties with him or her. Moreover, they respond to private inducements rather than policies, issues, or group identification on interests. The political system is thus constantly flooded with an unstructured mass of particularistic or rather specifically personal demands. Political system can meet these demands only sporadically and erratically, while collective or categorical demands are not being made or at least not met. Thus, politics are fundamentally issueless and non-ideological. The performance of state bureaucracy is characterized by corruption, inefficiency, and waste. Economic development and long-term policies in general cannot be effectively undertaken. At the same time, students of Ukrainian politics view Ukrainian polity as an embodiment of neo-patrimonial practices. This position is being championed by my colleague from Kharkiv University, political scientist from Kharkiv University, Alexander Fisun, or even sultanism, which is an extreme version of patrimonialism. This view is being promoted by political scientists from Rutgers University, Alexander Matil. Well, Alexander Matil, in fact, is producing pretty apocalyptic scenarios of Ukrainian development. According to him, Ukraine is basically doomed. Yanukovych is going is going to win a second presidential term, and during this presidential term, he will effectively destroy Ukraine as a society. Although I think this is more politically motivated claim than an academic scholarly argument. But let me get back to my own arguments. At first sight, clientelism and patrimonialism oppose each other, since clientelism presupposes a rather decentralized polity where decision-making mechanisms are based on muddling through, while under patrimonial system, the state is being under direct control of the ruler, who is seeking to break personal ties among members of ruling apparatuses and make him or herself a center, both institutional and symbolic, of the polity. Yet, in reality, I guess, patrimonialism operates via hierarchy of clientelisms. In fact, patrimonialism is an extreme form of clientelism where personal dependency of the agents of the ruler upon the personality of the ruler is stronger than ever. Well, it's quite obvious that it's critical for the successful establishment of the modern political institutions in Ukraine to break away from the post-Leninist neo-patrimonialism, since, as Max Weber observed, mass democracy, which makes a clean sweep of the feudal, patrimonial, and, at least in intent, the plutocratic privileges in administration, unavoidably has to put paid professional labor in place of historically inherited avocational administration by notables. This applies not only to the state, for it is no accident that in their own organizations, the democratic mass parties have completely broken with traditional rule by notables based upon personal relationship and personal esteem. Institutional and cultural background outlined above is conducive to the consolidation of a coercive dimension of power, or despotic power in terms of British-American sociologist Michael Mann. Michael Mann defines the coercive or despotic power as a power of state elite over civil society. And this type of power usually exists at the expense of what he calls infrastructural power, which means the power of the state to penetrate and centrally coordinate the activities of civil society through its own infrastructure. Well, in his own essay on this very subject, on this opposition of despotic versus infrastructural power, he gives a very good example of despotic power. It's Red Queen from Alice in the Wonderland. When Queen is here, she can order the execution of everybody. But once she's gone, nobody feels obliged or compelled to implement her orders. So, and this is basically the nature of political systems based on despotic power. Only provided that the whole state machinery is the whole state machinery, resources and energy is being channeled into one direction, the plausible, tangible results can be achieved. But once the state shifts its attention and focus to something else, the previous sector or sphere is being abandoned. The despotic power finds its paradigm institutional expression in practices of super-presidentialism, which preserves the democratic procedures on the surface, but undermines them critically in terms of their legitimacy and universal validity. According to University of California at Berkeley political scientist Stephen Fish, super-presidentialism represents one of the greatest global political frauds of the last quarter of the 20th century, since it has relegated one polity after another to chronic underdevelopment. Comparative analysis suggests that the rise of super-presidentialism on the post-Soviet terrains cannot be explained by the presence of charismatic political leaders. Rather, the success of such a political arrangements is embedded in overall political culture, more specifically its readiness to embrace a strong man who is viewed as an arbitrary yet just a counterbalance to the selfish actions of the state managers and extremely influential and powerful class of so-called robber barons. In some, presidentialism can be defined as an encouragement of personalism and patron-client relations, and as a debasement of impersonal institutionalization. Nevertheless, the bleak picture of Ukrainian politics painted above does not automatically entail the negative answer to the question posed at the beginning of this paper. Is developmental state possible in contemporary Ukraine? From the purely normativist perspective, the answer to this question ought to be negative. Should not the developmental state be lean and mean and capable of effective intervention into the economy? And the Ukrainian state does not seem to have such capabilities. Yet, I am of opinion that we should not be forgetting that the business of really existing developmental state, as epitomized by East Asian politics, so-called dragons or a gang of four. So this business has always been a pretty dirty business. For example, Japan, in the course of the 20th century, has undergone the transition from authoritarian militarist oligarchy to the ostensibly democratic arrangement, which de facto had been a single party rule for over 40 years. I refer here to the Liberal Democratic Party post-World War II hegemony. Taiwan and South Korea had for a long time been brutal military dictatorships. At the same time, these states have managed to preside over the creation of productive, rational, in Max Weber terms, capitalism. Now let me switch to the discussion of the possibilities of the development of the developmental state in Ukraine. I will skip the review of huge developmental state literature, which is mostly based on East Asian nations, these dragons, and other nations which are undergoing rapid industrialization. But I think it will suffice to mention that most scholars agree on the following: that the developmental state is supposed to be strong, which is quite self-obvious. It has to be autonomous vis-a-vis society, and as another University of California Berkeley scholar, sociologist Peter Evans famously put it, it is supposed to have embedded autonomy. So it has to be both embedded into the society while preserving its autonomy and independence as far as policy making is concerned vis-a-vis the society. So it's kind of very complicated dialectics or interplay of autonomy versus dependency. But again, you should not be forgetting that this embeddedness of the developmental state, again, if you look at classical examples of East Asian nations, so this embeddedness was very limited and was mostly limited to the close ties of state managers to the ruling capitalist elite. At the same time, it is very important to note that being capitalist in its nature, protecting interests of national bourgeoisie, East Asia developmental state has been capable of disciplining local capitalist classes. For example, 1970s and 1980s were lived in the world economy under the slogan, let's make a transition from import substitute industrialization to export-led development. Most third world governments were promoting the idea of this export-led growth, industrialization and development. Yet very few succeeded in actually implementing, imposing these policies on the local capitalist classes. These differences in outcomes can be explained by differences in the structure of the state. New York University-based sociologist Vivek Chibbe has produced some very interesting and revealing studies of how different outcomes are being generated by differences in structures of respective states which aspire to promoting developmental agenda. For example, South Korea under military dictatorship had governmental institutions vested with enough authority to impose and to implement developmental policies and breaking opposition to these policies. Opposition both within government and outside government, I mean from the society or capitalist classes. While in India, the state was lacking such institutions. Therefore, its capacity for imposing its own policies upon the economy or broader society was severely limited. The question naturally arises. What allows me to talk about the possibility of the emergence of developmental state in Ukraine? I will be wrapping up. Just two brief references to two examples which don't make me optimistic, but which provide some ground for thinking about the possibility of the emergence of a Ukrainian state. These examples will be, of course, controversial, but I think they are legitimate, and it's legitimate at least to think about them and to discuss them. First instance, it's Tymoshenko trial. It was purely politically motivated. She was found guilty on technicality. Nevertheless, Ukrainian state has been resilient in keeping her locked. I'm not saying that it's a good thing, but who said that developmental state is a nice thing? Ukrainian state has been very resilient in trying to keep her locked and standing against the pressure exercised, and it's a very unique situation, both from the West and from the East, because Tymoshenko by the European Union is considered as the leader opposition, so she's not supposed to be jailed, and by Russian authorities. It's also not a good thing for Russian political establishment that Tymoshenko is in prison because of very close, I would say even intimate economic ties of Tymoshenko to some very influential members of the Russian establishment. So Ukrainian state has been capable to stand to this pressure. Another example, kind of more productive and more creative, is the capacity of the Ukrainian state to preside over the successful European Soccer Championship. Again, it was clouded into, it was accompanied by the waste of resources, by the graft, but nevertheless, and I am summing up, Ukrainian state has shown some capabilities to formulate and implement policies in certain directions. So even if jumping to the final conclusion, I think it's legitimate to say, even if the project of Ukrainian developmental state is successful, it's definitely not going to be South Korean type developmental state. I guess it will more resemble Indian developmental state. So it's huge, cumbersome, not very efficient and very effective, but nevertheless capable of promoting and imposing certain developmental policies. Thank you.
Please, your questions.
Can I just make an observation, Pavlo? I come from Poland. There was a lot of graft and corruption going on with the soccer stadiums being built ahead of the championships. I think you may do Ukraine down on that. But I'm curious about why you think that Ukraine would possibly go like India. I just sort of think, again, you're being a bit pessimistic about the future of this nation. Surely it's got, you know, the ties with the East and also potentially with the European Union, which is wrapped up with Timoshenko. So don't you think you might just be being a bit downcast on your own country?
Okay, thank you for your question. It gives me a chance to clarify my position. I was not saying that Ukrainian society is going to reproduce kind of Indian patterns of development or mixture of development and underdevelopment in Ukraine. What I was saying was that Ukrainian state, its structure, its efficiency, its capacity and its autonomy, or rather lack of, will resemble the practices which exist in India. But of course, I hope that Ukrainian state won't be as autonomous to be able to bring Ukraine down to the Indian levels of development.
Two small questions. One is, you started very pessimistic, and you also spoke about this material. What do you think, in case it's really a failed state? What will be on this territory? Ukraine is really failed state. Failed
You mean failed?
Failed.
I see.
Failed state, so-called, you know, it's a discussion about failed state.
Not failed,
so
semi-state.
In case Ukraine is really failed state, if we will fail, what do you expect on this territory? This is the first question. And maybe...
Okay, let me answer this quite well. You know what, I have always considered myself a rather pessimistic observer of Ukrainian affairs, societal affairs, but after your question I think that I am very unrealistic I have considered myself being a pessimist, but after your question I think I am unrealistic optimist. I don't think it's legitimate or correct to apply the notion of failed state to Ukraine. Because if you look at this notion, it is usually being applied to nations like Afghanistan, and we are luckily very far away, not only geographically, but also structurally at the societal level. So Ukraine is definitely not a failed state, it's definitely not going to fail. Thus the answer to your question is as follows. It's going to be Ukrainian state on this territory.
Okay,
as simple as that. Let me just finish. Again, I'm not arguing that Ukrainian state is an embodiment of efficiency, rationality, effectiveness, autonomy, strength, capacity, and all other good things affiliated with the idea and practices of developmental state. But I think that it's plausible to claim that we are witnessing some developments in this direction. These developments are very subtle, very controversial, they can be reversed, they can be derailed, but still there is some hope.
And second question, also very small, is, you said that you spoke about this clientelistic patrimonial state, this kind of relationship in Ukraine, and then you stopped and said about these two good examples. What is the relation between patrimonial clientelistic relation in the state and your good example?
Okay,
Your two good examples, like Timoshenko and Euro.
Yeah, but first of all, this a good example in a very relative terms, not by themselves, but when they are contextualized. This is first thing. What is more important, again, if you look at prominent East Asian nations, which are considered as a classical example of the developmental state. After all, the notion of the developmental state was coined specifically for Japan by American sociologist Chalmers Johnson, and then it was subsequently applied to these newly industrialized nations, tigers, gang of four, you name them. So, if you look at these states, they were authoritarian. Japan was a militaristic, authoritarian dictatorship monarchy till 1945. Then it was dominated by a single party, a liberal democratic party, which was ostensibly winning democratic multi-party elections. Nevertheless, it managed to hold its political hegemony for 40 years. And its hegemony was mostly based on clientelist practices, very corrupt practices. If you look at South Korea or Taiwan, they had been for a long time military dictatorship with widespread rampant corruption. Basically, what I'm driving at is that developmental state can emerge in a kind of very hostile, unfriendly setting, and I don't think that we should be waiting kind of for some ideal situation, for some ideal precondition when everything is neat and nice and you've got very efficient multi-party liberal political establishment, very tolerant political culture, very conscious and very conscious professional public service, and then we can start thinking about the building developmental state. Quite the contrary. These types of states are being built in societies which are experiencing profound crises and facing very fundamental challenges, when basically, well, not their survival is at stake, but when they have to think really seriously about their prospects and about their position within the structure of nation states, within the world system.
Okay.
So, this, the last question. Professor
Pavlo, you described clientelist state, or maybe we can refer even to the concept of crony capitalism in this context.
Exactly.
And at the same time, we're speaking here about the phenomenon of periphery in the world economy. So, what do you think? Is there any connection between the periphery capitalism and the clientelist state? And what is the cause and what is the effect in this way?
Thank you for your brilliant question. Well, basically, it's a chicken and eggs situation. What comes first?
Depends what you have at breakfast.
One can have both for breakfast, I guess. Very nutritious breakfast. I guess it's extremely hard to distinguish in this case between chicken and eggs. It's kind of very complicated mixture of both, very complicated dish. The Ukrainian road to the periphery was triggered by the collapse and downfall of the Soviet Union. Then integration into the periphery in its own turn accelerated and reinforced these corrupt clientelist practices. So I think there is very strong correlation between these two factors. And well, the answer basically depends on what research program or paradigm we subscribe. If we tend to lean to more world systems analysis, as exemplified by Manuel Wallerstein, then the answer is obvious. The Soviet Union itself was a dependent territory, kind of was heavily integrated in the capitalist world economy. Therefore, all negative consequences of its downfall were directly caused by its structural position. If we are more kind of state-centered, the answer would be kind of more reserved, and we would have to look at interplay of domestic forces, of state capturing, state privatization, and a very ineffective use of the state apparatus, which in fact is very huge in Ukraine, potentially is very powerful, but right now only a small fraction of its capacity is being used productively.
So, I'm not going